Thank you so much for joining us here at Luminos as we discuss the important question of how leaders who are facing the question of how to drive their education systems through this COVID pandemic, which is an unprecedented pandemic that has hit the world and has really affected education. What decisions should leaders be making? So with that background, I'd love to dive in. You've written a wonderful book not too long ago called Leapfrogging Inequality. And in there, I was really impressed by the way you established right up front that there are two significant challenges that education systems face, skills inequality and skills uncertainty. I wonder whether you could start by just telling us a little bit about that work and explain to us why that framework is really important.
Thanks, Mbuso. Well, skills inequality is really the inability of many education systems around the world to deliver to their students the development of academic and 21st century skills equally. So some kids and some get it, usually kids who are higher income, and a lot of kids don't. So that's the inequality piece. It's basically inequality in educational outcomes. Both academic and 21st century skills. So, and unfortunately, it's increasingly relevant because in a COVID world, that gap, that inequality has just gone bigger and bigger, especially as many parents around the world are charged with being their kids' teacher, which is overwhelming and allows the more high-resourced families to let kids run ahead versus those families who don't have as many resources. Really, kids have many fewer opportunities. So that's why that dimension is especially relevant these days. And the other dimension is this idea of skills uncertainty, which is basically the idea that we have a very fluid world of work with changing technology over time. And the skills that young people are going to have to prepare for are lifelong learning skills that will allow them to navigate an uncertain future. And those lifelong learning skills are absolutely crucial, and poor kids need them as much as rich kids, but they're hard to get. And it really means teachers are going to have to change how they do their pedagogy. Teaching and learning experiences are going to have to be much more rich. So those are the two big problems we have.
Thank you. That's a good place to start. And so along those lines, you will know better than most that the current discourse in education reform is reaching into the conversation about building back better. I think that's a term that's being slung around quite regularly right now as people try to figure out how not to waste a good crisis. But I think not a lot of us actually know what that phrase means. I wonder whether you could unpack it for us.
Well, I have spent in my career many years working on education and crisis. So what do you do amid crisis? What do you do post-crisis? How do you think about recovery? And building back better is a phrase that comes out of the humanitarian sector. And it just means, I'll give you a classic example. It just means when you go to rebuild an education system post-crisis, try to rebuild it in a way that is better than how you left it. Don't just go back straight to what it was pre-crisis. The classic example is from a recent, in the last decade, earthquake in Pakistan. Terrible earthquake, devastated huge swaths of the country. And there was a big motto about building back better, which meant making sure that schools were built earthquake-proof. And had better infrastructure. So if there's ever an earthquake again, they didn't collapse and tragically, kill students and teachers inside. So that's a classic example of what we mean by build back better. In the era of COVID, I think we should use it as a principle that we're quite inspired, that can inspire fresh thinking, but I don't think you apply it quite as classically.
That's helpful. Sort of following on to that, I had a wonderful conversation with George Werner, former Minister of Education from Liberia, and he pressed upon the idea that there are three important P's when it comes to education reform. He mentioned policy, politics, and practice. But I think there might be a fourth one in there that you're really familiar with, and that's parenting. I wonder whether you could speak to all four and in the context of building back better in an education crisis.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the topic of parenting. We have started before the coronavirus pandemic a large initiative around parent demand for quality and relevant education and parent engagement in their children's education, really as the lever to spur innovation and system change. And we find ourselves amid the coronavirus with parent engagement being a central rather than a marginal topic, which is very much how we thought of it when we started this initiative. And I actually think this is one of the areas where when we think about building back better in education, parent engagement is ripe for transformation. I think a lot of parents absolutely don't want to be their kid's teacher and will be very happy when schools reopen and can, go out to work again, etc. But at the same time, I think parents are going to want to stay much more on top of and be much more regularly informed about what is happening in their kids' schools. And that level of engagement in children's learning, rather than sort of external activities such as coming to a bake sale or helping build, a classroom wall, all of which are fine and good, but don't necessarily help their children learn better. So I think that engagement with their children's learning and really being able to see what they can do to help their kids learn has the potential to be really transformative if policymakers and practitioners, getting back to your other P's, make sure to lean into that and support parents in that journey, even after the coronavirus pandemic is over.
Thank you. There's a raging debate, particularly in the United States, about whether schools should reopen or not. I wonder what your position is, and perhaps the position of Brookings as a whole, as to whether schools should open in this country and indeed across the world right now.
It's a good question. Brookings, as an institution, does not hold institutional positions. We're much like an academic institution. So we have a raging debate inside our institution about whether schools should reopen. It really comes down to a couple of factors. One is, for places that are able to reopen successfully, I think places like Denmark or Finland, and we've had colleagues interview their ministers of education while reopening was happening, really trying to parse out what they did. There is a very well-established public health system that is able to test students who come down with symptoms and contact trace back to their families and all the families that those students will have exposed to the virus. So I really think that it depends on how a country is going to be able to handle public health concerns. Is there enough protection for teachers? There's a lot of teachers in the workforce who have been teaching for quite some time, and those are wonderful teachers. You want them around, and yet they might be the most vulnerable to the virus. So I think that's number one. Countries have to take a look at what they can do. The second thing I think countries have to take a look at is what is feasibly possible to continue learning opportunities without necessarily congregating children. And these can be complementary, supplementary or core. There's interactive radio instruction. There's lots of things happening via broadcast and remote learning in different parts of the world. And how can systems lean in and really make those effective? So to be effective, students have to have some interaction with teachers. That has to be engaging. There's a whole science to how to make sure remote learning can be maximally effective. And then I think a third thing that countries have to look at is really the risk of children attending school. How risky is it in terms of spread of the coronavirus pandemic versus the associated risks of being at home? And for men, there's sadly a small proportion, but a really important proportion of very vulnerable kids who are at home, perhaps in abusive family environments, very little nutrition, and food, and mental health concerns. And for those kids, school is literally a lifesaver. So you could imagine prioritizing those kids first, the most vulnerable. And so I think those are the types of factors you have to look at. And ultimately, I think if I had to sort of say where people are leaning, a lot of my colleagues are leaning towards reopening schools because they're, with various caveats that I explained, because they are such an essential part of helping children, especially the most vulnerable children, develop cognitively, but also social, emotionally, physically, with all the sort of health interventions that schools have.
Change in ecosystems and systems depends on the participation of various stakeholders. And a key one is, I'd imagine, the role that Brookings plays as a public policy and research organization. Could you perhaps help us understand what role you play in helping push us forward to a place where we can actually truly build back better?
Well, I think that we would aspire to be very helpful in doing a few things. One is we're going to be tracking what are the types of approaches that and innovations that people are doing right now, and they could be through a public-private partnership, it could be the society, it could be government, it could be parent organizations, many different people in the sort of teaching and learning ecosystems. It could be a teacher organization that are both helpful in terms of addressing students' learning needs amid COVID, and actually are good things to do no matter what. Could be transformative, could help leap words we use, education, and should be sustained even after one day, knock on wood, the coronavirus disappears. And so our ability to identify those, come up with criteria, assess them based on evidence, make recommendations to policymakers and practitioners around how to identify those and what our list looks like, is hopefully going to be very helpful, especially when we think about a beyond reopening agenda, which is where we're really quite focused. How can we use this moment to really leapfrog education? Because if this is not a leapfrog moment in education, I don't know what would be.
That's a great place to pick up this question. This is a leapfrog moment, as you put it. I like that phrasing. And for many ministers of education across the world, this is a defining moment in their leadership and careers. Well, what advice might you have for new and existing ministers of education?
My advice would be to be very open and take a look with what people are doing, because there's been responses all around the place. You've got unlikely education allies who are stepping up to the plate. Radio stations, television programs, celebrities putting content out for free that is of high quality. I'm thinking of in the US, for example, Michelle Obama doing regular book readings, but also you have National Geographic explorers putting out their lessons for free. So that's some example with tech, but then you've got a lot of non-tech related things where you have community networks supporting teachers with tools to try to reach family members. You've got all sorts of things happening. And my advice to them would be to really, really, really be open to what has bubbled up and emerged, and try to think very, very clearly about what they would like to sustain. What are great components of the education ecosystem that have been sort of galvanized into action, that are outside the school building, that could partner with the school moving forward and really create, in my mind, a powered up school, a school that is much more effective as a real core center for community rebuilding in the wake of the coronavirus, and to really reach out to those partners, even if they're groups that they would have not traditionally worked with before. That would be my advice.
Excellent, excellent. Rebecca, you've established yourself and are recognized as one of the key leaders in international education development and reform just by virtue of who you are and what you've done and what you've contributed. I wonder if we personalize it. I wonder when you look back at your leadership journey, what lessons have you distilled for yourself, and what sort of lessons might you share with people about leadership?
Mm. Well, I've had a career that has both been very much in the trenches, sort of running programs at community level at the beginning to sort of policy level with large organizations, and in the last decade really doing uh, evidence to practice work, which is what we do at the Center for Universal Education at Brookings, really trying to take all that evidence out there that is incredibly overwhelming. If you are a practitioner and need to make decisions within 2 days, a week, a month, and distill it, fill research evidence gaps that people need in order to make good decisions and move forward. And so across all of those positions, I think a couple of the things that I have internalized as how to be effective in promoting change in education, which has been my goal personally, so that really you get a more inclusive educational process where those left behind are included. That's been my personal motivation. That's why I do this work. Education changed my life, and I actually truly believe that it does have the power to change the trajectory. And as a leader, I think I've learned that if you are humble and don't necessarily take credit, and that includes not necessarily putting your logo on things, you could get a lot done. Now that is easier to do in a place like Brookings, where we do quite a bit of behind the scenes policy advising. It's harder to do, I recognize, for other leaders, perhaps nonprofit leaders who have to, are required to put their logo on things. So, I think it's not always easy for people to do that, but I do think it is something I've through trial and tribulation along the way, that if you can help other people own the ideas and the approaches that you think are really going to be transformative, and it's probably the best strategy for sustainability.
Thank you. Rebecca, what do we do about the digital divide and the fact that as countries and communities and parents are trying to figure out what the new reality looks like? We're preparing for opening and closing down schools at a moment's notice. We're looking at various forms of remote learning. But the reality is that children at the margins will continue to be the least reached and in some ways the hardest to serve. But the digital divide, I think, is quite troublesome and worrying, because a lot of the interventions that are being recommended run the risk of not reaching these particular children. What are your thoughts?
I think it's an excellent point, but I would caveat the digital divide concern, which is real, with the notion that there are actually now lots of different ways to help young people get access to what a digital interface offers, which is different from radio and broadcast. It's interactive, right? That's what a digital interface offers. It's interactive and it's got much more content. It can be personalized, unlike some of the other remote learning strategies, in an offline way. And this is really, again, where our work on Leapfrogging Inequality, where we canvassed a great deal of education innovations around the world, is relevant to this moment in time. And there are solutions where you don't need connectivity, internet connectivity, to have a sturdy tablet with preloaded content that can use adaptive learning or personalized learning to learn to read, for example, or gamified approaches for learning math, all of which are a great solution at this moment in time, because they engage children don't need a teacher interface to deliver them, and can be delivered offline. So those are solutions that are in some of the remotest corners of the globe, but are equally relevant to places like here in the United States for communities and families that don't have connectivity, for example.
Rebecca, what's the role of funding when it comes to building education systems back better? Let's look across the spectrum from the international organizations, the multilateral and bilateral organizations, through to the philanthropic organizations, and perhaps even the individuals who are contributing in various ways. What's the role and contribution of funding?
Well, without resources, you can't do much. But in terms of building back better, uh, I think it's less about needing more money to build back better and more about effectively using your dollars, if you really are thinking about building back better. That being said, I am quite worried, and there's a large cohort of organizations who are advocating to make sure that education budgets are protected, and though that is a significant worry with a massive global recession. So you want to make sure that education is not on the chopping block in terms of funding. And it's, I would say, crucial to continue paying teachers who are also, a large percentage in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries of GDP, and, are scattered around the country. So it's a way of distributing income. There's lots of funding streams that need to continue in education, but you can also think, and this is maybe where the national donors, philanthropic and multilateral, bilateral can come in, is the dollars that they are deploying. How can they use those dollars to take some of the new approaches that have come up during COVID and scale them? Approaches that are going to be ultimately very effective going forward, with or without a virus.
So I'm asking all of our guests this following question. What was your favorite book growing up? And perhaps what books are you reading today?
What was my favorite book growing up? I had many. I was a big Jane Austen fan, so anything by her. One of the books I read multiple times growing up was the Lord of the Ring series. So I also like sci-fi. And I missed out on Harry Potter, but I've read all of them to my children. And at the moment, I'm reading a book called The Secret Life of Bees. It's a novel.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I really appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness.